Welcome, everyone. I'm just really thrilled that you are all part of this exciting COVID vaccine listening session. Without further ado, we're going to just jump right in. You all have seen the agenda and the questions, so I'm just going to introduce our esteemed Dr. Donald Williams, MD, and he is going to run our listening session. So thank you for coming.
Thank you all. I'm an internal medicine and pediatric specialist. So the last 4 years, I've been doing mostly pediatrics. In my career, I have always been in awe of opportunities, and lots of my friends, I don't call them patients anymore after being in practice for 41 years. They're more like friends and family. Lots of them have been opportunities, clients for a long time. And so it's an impressive organization, and even more impressive hearing more about it on the board. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about COVID, most of which you probably know, but talk about especially about the whole vaccine issues. Currently, and I looked at all my information actually went to the CDC website, which is probably the most up-to-date website to find information about vaccines, disease, etc. Although, as everyone knows, and watching the Today Show this morning, there are changes in terms of who's getting sick. It's now young people. It's not old folks anymore. So almost every day information changes, but there's probably close to a third of Americans who have contracted COVID already. And unfortunately, there's more than 600,000 people whose deaths have been thought to be directly related to it. And probably another 100,000. For example, if I catch COVID and then have a heart attack, well, they don't say COVID caused my death. The heart attack did. But the numbers of people who have died, and I'm sure everyone on this call knows of people who've had severe COVID. In our office, where we have about 40 employees, 2 of our employees caught COVID and have had long haul disease, where they were on oxygen for a long time and still struggling with brain fatigue, etc. One of our office nurses' brother died in his 20s of COVID disease a couple months ago. So it really touches close to all of our hearts. The number of people hospitalized is crazy. It's almost 6 million, which means that if there's 120 million, 1 in 20 people ends up getting hospitalized. That's much higher than the rate of hospitalizations for influenza, pneumonias, or any other condition we really can see or name. And one of the struggles with COVID is there are patients who are having these ongoing symptoms. I mean, they're called long haulers. The biggest symptoms they seem to have are fatigue, muscle pain, and probably the most troubling one is brain fog. I need my brain to be as clear as possible, and I can't imagine the people who struggle with brain fog as a consequence. The vaccines are an impressive advance in medicine. In fact, those of you who are old enough to remember when 2000 rolled around, there were lots of things about what was the best this or that of the 1900s, which sounds ancient now. But in medicine, the best advance in the 1900s is clearly felt to be the development of vaccinations. And being old enough, in my first grade class, I had one boy who had crutch canes and leg braces, having had polio. And I had a girl who had hearing loss from measles. And she had this hearing aid that's about the size of a shoebox that she wore on her chest as a consequence of measles. Fortunately, now because of vaccines, I've never seen a case of polio, although I took care of a number of people who had something called post-polio syndrome, which was sort of a recurrence of their symptoms in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. And most young doctors have never seen measles, mumps, German measles, and a lot of those diseases that were around years ago because of the wonders of vaccines. And the same, I hope, is true of vaccines and the course of COVID. I do often tell people, as a physician, I've considered in my career that I do 3 things. The first and the most exciting is that we put out fires. That's treating someone who has an ear infection, fixing a broken arm, taking care of a gallbladder attack, those kinds of things are fun for physicians because you get instant gratification. Another area that physicians deal with, and as my patients aged along with me, is easing patients' transition into heaven, and that involves organizations such as hospice, etc. And that's a rewarding part of my career, but in a different fashion. But the thing that we all physicians spend the most of our time doing is trying to stack the deck in favor of people being healthier. And I never know which person I treat for high blood pressure doesn't have a heart attack because of my medicine, or in the case of vaccinations, who got a vaccination that saved their lives. But we do know that many people who get vaccinations save lives. And that's why I'm a super proponent of vaccines. I received the 17 questions you sent me, and in fact, I actually dictated a response to each of them, which they're going to send out after this meeting, so you can all see my written comments. But I'd like to just talk a minute about the COVID vaccine. It is an amazing effort on the part of the United States that they were able to create and develop vaccines in such short order. The good news is, in the process, there were really no shortcuts taken. These processes take a long time and require a lot of people to be involved in research, testing, etc. And in America, that was ramped up quickly. There was no difficulty getting volunteers to take a vaccine. In fact, one of our hospital emergency physicians tried to get her children signed up in Minneapolis. She was willing to make the 6-hour drive to Minneapolis to get her children into a vaccine study. So getting people into the vaccine studies was not difficult. And in fact, now that the vaccine has been administered to hundreds of millions of people worldwide, and consequences or adverse reactions to vaccines are continuously monitored, we really realize that this is an extremely safe vaccine and an extremely effective vaccine. Currently in America, there are the 3 vaccines. 2 of them are very similar. They're made by the Moderna company and Pfizer company. And both of those vaccines inject a little bit of instructions into our body that tells us to make what I call the front bumper of the coronavirus. If you're going to get hit by the virus, it's the bumper that's going to hit you first. And what they do is they stimulate us to make that bumper, which is recognized by our bodies as abnormal. And our body then creates antibodies and immunity against that bumper. And if the bumper can't penetrate us, then we can't get ill from the disease. The 3rd vaccine, Johnson & Johnson, actually injects little bits of the bumper into us, not the whole virus, but just the bumper. And our body creates antibodies against that, which prevents us from becoming ill with the disease. None of the vaccines contain any of the COVID particles. So some of the concerns about people getting ill from the vaccine are impossible to happen. There clearly are people who get the vaccine and catch COVID at the same time, and that would make people sit up and say, I got the COVID from the vaccine. But 2 things happening at the same time don't mean don't mean that they're related. Is there a question? Nope. There are a couple of adverse events from the vaccine that are notable, one of which has been a very rare, and I believe both of these are less than 1 in a million individuals who received the vaccine, were women who developed blood clots. And I think in America there have been somewhere between 30 and there were initially reported 30 women who developed a generalized clotting disorder from it. It's extremely rare. It happened in women, all of whom were under 50 years of age, which might make me steer someone to the other vaccines, but that was a Johnson & Johnson related vaccine. The other significant issue was there were patients, especially teenage boys who got the vaccine, who got heart inflammation. The good news is that heart inflammation appears to resolve over a 6-week period, and there have not been long-term consequences. The consequences of the vaccine are so far less than the consequences of the disease, however. When you talk about hearts, for example, our local cardiac rehabilitation, which is a facility that treated people who'd had heart attacks to get them back on their feet, improve their level of conditioning, etc., has been overwhelmed now with people who've developed heart failure as a consequence of the COVID vaccine. And I'm sorry, of the COVID illness, not the vaccine. And so the risks, as I tell everyone every time I give vaccinations, what we're doing with a vaccine is we are balancing a high risk of disability, etc., from the disease with a minuscule risk from the vaccine. And that's true of polio, chickenpox, measles. All the vaccines we administer have some minuscule risk. However, when you compare the risk of the disease and consequences of the disease, the vaccines are felt to be overwhelmingly in their favor. The COVID virus, like other viruses, has changed and mutated. And I'm sure everyone's very aware of the Delta variant. The name Delta came because this is sort of the 4th generation of COVID. The original one was called the Alpha strain. And we've gone through Alpha, Beta, Gamma, and now Delta. And the Delta mutation, which is something that just randomly occurs. The example I often give is influenza. We have to get a flu shot every year because the influenza tends to change, so that last year's vaccine may not be effective against this year's influenza. Although I have to say, after having flu shots for more than 40 years straight and seeing probably a couple dozen influenza patients every winter, except this past one, I've never caught influenza, so I think that the cumulative effect of years and years of vaccine have made a difference. But the Delta variant of the COVID vaccine has changed itself in a couple ways. One, so that it is able to get around the body's immunity, and people who've had the vaccines can become ill with it. The good news is it prevents them from becoming sick enough. The vaccine prevents them from becoming ill enough that hospitalizations are rare and deaths even more rare in vaccinated individuals. I think the current statistics are that people hospitalized, 97% or greater are people who've not received a vaccine. So it clearly, while not necessarily completely preventing the illness, has made it a much milder illness. The other concerns about the vaccine are the change in who it's affecting. And it's not clear whether it's affecting young people because they are less likely to be immunized, or whether there's something about the vaccine that targets young people more than it does older people. All the childhood diseases, measles, mumps, German measles, influenza, colds, etc., are much more common in children, and children seem to tolerate those diseases much better. If anyone ever knows someone who got chickenpox as an adult, it's an awful disease, absolutely awful. Chickenpox used to be part of every child's life until we developed a vaccine about 35 years ago. So the vaccines have made a difference, and with the COVID, the vaccine has made a difference. That's probably enough of me talking. How can I answer, or what questions might you have?
Okay, I'll go first. This may be a hard question to answer, but what do you think the prospects are for a virus mutation for which the vaccine will not be effective?
There's probably a couple things that play a role in that. The more people who get COVID illness, the more opportunities the virus has to mutate. Probably a person who gets COVID sheds into the environment millions of copies of COVID that were produced inside their body. So if you get 1 million people who get COVID, that's 1 million times 1 million. If you get 300 or 500, I think current numbers are 500 or 600 million people worldwide have thought to gotten it. That's a lot more opportunity for the virus to mutate. This virus is incredible in that it is like the perfect storm of an illness, and its ability to mutate may continue to make it a perfect storm. I do know that the vaccine manufacturers are looking at tweaking how they've made their vaccines to try to accommodate for changes the COVID virus has had, just as the makers of influenza vaccines every year tweak the influenza virus to accommodate new strains that emerge. Along with that, I just heard that the FDA, this morning's report was that the FDA is probably going to recommend a third booster of a couple of the vaccines. And when you get the vaccines, the first shot takes you like up one step of the stairway. The second shot takes you up 3 steps of the stairway. And the third shot probably would take you up 5 or 7 steps up the stairway. So it's an exponential increase in immunity from subsequent shots. So I think that there's a good point where we probably will be getting a third dose of vaccine, at least of some of the vaccines. And we maybe get vaccines that are modified. It may become like a flu shot where there's an annual booster. No one can predict that, especially myself.
Doctor, my question is, what percentage of those people who are presenting with the Delta variant are vaccinated? And what is the percentage or what is the chance of actually just getting the disease if you are vaccinated?
Because a lot of cases of COVID are asymptomatic, it has been tough to determine exactly how many people have the disease. For example, blood banks are testing everybody who donates blood to see if they have antibodies against COVID. And I think in parts of the country, those numbers were in the 30% back when only 5 or 10% of the people actually had symptoms of COVID. So it's not really possible to predict that. It definitely decreases your risk. And I think the thought is it decreases your risk by at least a third of catching it if you're exposed.
Hi, Dr. Williams. You mentioned a couple minutes ago that the FDA is considering a booster, a third booster. Do you know, have you heard when they will fully endorse and authorize the original vaccinations instead of the current emergency use authorization? Because I think that would help with a lot of the hesitancy that we're seeing in the communities.
Yeah. The process by which the FDA approves any new medicine, drug, vaccine, et cetera, is a very long, very cumbersome process. A lot of it requires looking at safety, not just, we've had the vaccine now since I think December was the first doses available. So we have had it like 9 months. Part of this, the safety requirements is looking at other long-term effects from the vaccine. And that's part of what has held up the change to a completely approved drug versus the emergency use. The one thing about this drug, though, is, and in my career, there have been many medications. There was a anti-arthritis medicine that my dad was put on, and it caused his fingernails to fall off. Well, they didn't discover that until the medicine hadn't been out in the market for 6 months, and it had been administered on, 200,000 or 300,000 prescriptions before they started getting reports of that. That medicine was pulled from the market, but that was 200,000 or 300,000 patients. This drug has now been given to millions. And so we do have, in the numbers of patients administered the medicine or the vaccine, we have a lot more information than would traditionally be provided. Information off the New York Times indicated that the FDA is within weeks of approving, I think it was Moderna or Pfizer, as a final approval. All of those evaluations are in process, and obviously I'm not privy to all the studies that are looked at with those. But the fact that it has made such a huge benefit, I have no idea how many patients who shed COVID that I have seen in the past year. Thank God I haven't gotten it, because I'm at higher risk based on my age and my blood pressure. The vaccines have clearly been effective, and we have not seen, with the numbers of vaccines administered, we've not seen significant life-threatening or life-altering consequences occur.
We've been real consistent with following CDC guidance, and that includes reinstating our masking requirement. We started that on Tuesday, and it's come with a fair amount of consternation, and but we're working through that and explaining to our employees and our consumers, because we have some guardians that see this as an infringement on people's rights and so forth. I see it as our obligation to keep our work sites as safe as possible, because we know not everyone is vaccinated here. And we're trying to be consistent with the CDC guidance. So in your opinion, is masking, knowing that we work in a very similar environment as OpInc, is masking something that you would also recommend for all of our consumers and staff?
Okay, let me talk a minute about masks. And I think actually the CDC kind of blew it early when masks were commonly used in China, Japan, and they said you don't need to wear masks in America. And then they later on said, oh, without really coming out and admitting I blew it, they blew it. Studies done from masks show they do two things. One is they protect me from inhaling COVID particles. They get trapped in the mask, and so they don't get into my lungs. And that clearly is a benefit of wearing a mask. What they do actually much better, though, is if I have COVID, especially if I don't know it and I'm going around places and I cough, whatever, they trap my COVID particles in the mask itself. And that's where masks are most helpful, to prevent someone who has COVID from sharing it. I don't think the word sharing is a good term, inflicting it upon others. And so there is a benefit from the mask. And in fact, because that second benefit is the most important one, the kinds of masks that have a little vent, I used to have those when I do my woodworking that I'd put on so I don't inhale sawdust, and I don't care what I inhale out it, but those actually defeat the benefit of reducing the spread of virus particles to others. So the mask mandates do make sense. They make sense both, and I wear one to protect myself, and I think our experience in our hospital, where they've had, I don't even know, dozens and dozens of cases of COVID admitted, many very severe, they have had a very few employees who have caught COVID from a patient because of wearing masks, at the same time gowns, gloves, things to prevent the COVID virus from getting on your clothes, and you're later transferring them into your system. So the masks clearly work, and as I think we all thought once we were vaccinated, it didn't matter. And now what they've discovered is that some people with the Delta variant who are vaccinated will get sick, which is why they're saying, and why I have my mask next to me here, why they're saying when you're in public places, wear a mask, which is I've taken putting my mask on when I go to the hardware store or the lumber yard or the grocery store or whatever again, just to reduce risk of it. A second part of your question is people's concerns that the rules that have been put into place are in I can't think what the word I want to use, violating my liberties. Is that the sense of what you said, Dave? Okay. And it is. On the other hand, so are wearing seatbelts, so are not drinking and driving. So are lots of things that we do in society because they are good ideas. Washing your hands after going to the bathroom, the things we teach our children and grandchildren, all of those are done because of a benefit to society. They all are a little bit of a personal infringement, and I certainly accept that. Wearing a mask all day long makes my nose, in the office makes my nose sore, it makes my eyes tear. There's some disability associated. However, if I can prevent myself from spreading it to someone else who may be at higher risk, we do lots of things to prevent illness and disability, et cetera, in others. I think that's the framework on which I can accept a loss of some of my personal liberties for the betterment of everyone else. As a physician, I've always practiced using the golden rule as kind of my motto: do unto others as you'd like them to do to you. And I think some of the issues regarding COVID, the golden rule probably applies to some of the things we were asked to do.
Thank you for that response. One of the responses I got was, geez, Dave, I already made the personal sacrifice of getting the vaccine where he or she ordinarily may not have had, and they thought that the reward for that, of course, is to be safe and not and whatnot, but also not have to wear a mask. And I completely understand that argument. And so the question to me is how long is this going to last? And of course, I don't have the answer. I don't expect you to have the answer. But what I tell people, and maybe and let me know if I'm right, though, is that regardless of if this country gets to herd immunity through vaccination, this is a global pandemic. And until the entire globe gets to a certain level of herd immunity, for lack of better terminology, isn't that really what we're dealing with? Is because these variants are going to continue to grow and continue to spread into different variants, and unless there's enough protection globally, we're going to be dealing with this for an awful long time. Is that a fair assessment?
It's actually very, very fair. And I tell people, if I could predict the future, I'd be in stocks and bonds, not medicine. In fact, I probably wouldn't even be in them anymore. I'd be retired in the Bahamas, although I'm not sure I want to go to the Bahamas the way the weather's been there the last few years. But predicting the future is impossible. And that's why I think a lot of people have been frustrated. People thought the vaccine was going to be the end all, and then the virus has changed to show now that people who've had the vaccine can get it. And in fact, what they surprisingly they shed a lot of virus particles, even though they're not very sick. And I don't think anyone could have predicted that. I do think COVID virus is going to be a major player in disability, illness, and death in the world for a long time to come. I don't know that there's enough herd immunity possible to make the virus go away, just like influenza has never gone away. And there's never been an illness like COVID, probably since the days of the Black Plague in medieval Europe, when I think even more people died of plague. Someone had asked about allergic reactions to the vaccine, and they are rare. I actually queried how many severe reactions have occurred in Jefferson County, where they've given thousands of vaccines, Jefferson County being where we're located. And there have only been a very few where people had an acute allergic reaction. There are far less allergic reactions to the COVID vaccine than there are to peanuts every day or every week in America. So the vaccine has been very safe. And I do tell people in the current recommendations, if you have a history of a bad reaction to a vaccine, or if you have a history of severe allergies, it's recommended that you have a conversation with your physician. There are all these individual components in the vaccine that you can look at and see whether they are something that you reacted to. So for almost everybody who has a history of allergies, getting a shot is very, very low risk of having allergic reaction. The studies that have been done have shown that within 90 days of getting COVID, almost no one ever gets COVID again, okay? After 90 days, there are cases of people having COVID. I knew of two people who had COVID like a year ago, March, and then got it this last fall. So there is a risk of catching COVID. It is less than the risk of being unvaccinated. No one knows exactly how the virus causes us to be immune to getting it again, or how long that immunity will last. I mean, we're only, a year and a half from COVID onset in America. And so and it's going to be probably years down the road before anybody really knows. I can't tell you, and I don't think anybody really can tell you whether your immunity is going to be better after getting the disease or better after getting the vaccine. Current thoughts are, because we know that the vaccine attacks the bumper part or the little kind of thorns that stick out of the COVID, that's thought to be a mechanism that's extremely effective. And so that may not be the mechanism by which you're immune if you get the disease. And so the recommendation has been, yes, after the first 90 days, when your body may have enough antibodies left over from the illness, that may make the vaccine less effective. It is recommended that people get the vaccine. And again, it's kind of like, well, if I got up 3 steps on the stairway with the illness, maybe I can get another 5 or 8 steps if I add the vaccine on top of it. So,
okay, this has been great, Dr. Williams. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
You're welcome.
All right.